today continuing our book club on Pride and Prejudice and Patriarchy. If you haven't watched my previous videos, go back and watch my first and second video before you watch this one so you will know where we're at in the story. Today we are going to continue with chapter 7. The chapter starts out with introducing a dilemma that the Bennets have. Because Mr. Bennet does not have a son, his property, his estate, is entailed away to a distant relative. And so what that means is if Mr. Bennet dies before Mrs. Bennet, the girls, they are dependent on their relative that takes the estate. Mrs. Bennet has a sister who is married to a Mr. Phillips, who had been a clerk to her father and succeeded him in business, and a brother settled in London in a respectable line of trade. So Mrs. Bennet has brothers that are workers and they're in trade. They are a lower class family. Mr. Bennet married Miss Bennet because he fell in love, but they were not really an equal match. So Catherine and Lydia like to go visit their Aunt Phillips. The Bennets are fortunate to have Mr. and Mrs. Phillips as their aunt and uncle, even though Mr. Phillips is a tradesman, he's still really awesome. Catherine and Lydia like to go visit their aunt and talk to her about the gossip of the town. So now Catherine and Lydia can talk of nothing but the officers. Here they are sitting at the table discussing it. After listening one morning to their effusions on this subject, Mr. Bennet coolly observed, "From all that I can collect by your manner of talking, you must be two of the silliest girls in the country. I have suspected it some time, but I am now convinced." Mr. Bennet realizes that his daughters are the silliest girls in the country. All they're concerned about are the officers. Mr. Bennet, here again, is observing from the outside, attempting to do nothing about the issue, just complaining. "I'm astonished, my dear," said Miss Bennet, "that you should be so ready to think your own children silly. If I wish to think slightingly of anybody's children, it should not be of my own, however." "If my children are silly, I must hope to always be sensible of it," says Mr. Bennet. "Yes, but as it happens, they are all of them very clever," says Miss Bennet, who isn't very clever herself. "This is the only point, I flatter myself, on which we do not agree. I had hoped that our sentiments coincided in every particular, but I must so far differ from you as to think our two youngest daughters uncommonly foolish. Miss Bennet thinks they're all sensible. He has to disagree with her on this issue. They are uncommonly foolish." They talk in this manner till Jane receives a letter from Miss Bingley at Netherfield. Miss Bennet was prevented replying by the entrance of the footman with a note for Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and the servant waited for an answer. Miss Bennet's eyes sparkled with pleasure, and she was eagerly calling out while her daughter read, "Well, Jane, who is it from? What is it about? What does he say?" "Well, Jane, make haste and tell us. Make haste, my love." "It is from Miss Bingley," said Jane, and then read it aloud. Miss Bennet automatically assumed it was from Mr. Bingley. "My dear friend, if you are not so compassionate as to dine today with Louisa and me, we shall be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives, for a whole day's tete-a-tete between two women can never end without a quarrel. Come as soon as you can on the receipt of this. My brother and the gentleman are to dine with the officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley." Okay, though I cannot pronounce it, I did look up the meaning of the word tete-a-tete, whatever. A private conversation between two people is what that means. "With the officers," cried Lydia. "I wonder my aunt did not tell us of that." "Dining out," said Miss Bennet. "That is very unlucky." But the gentleman will be dining out because then Mr. Bingley can't fall in love with Jane. "Can I have the carriage?" said Jane. "No, my dear, you had better go on horseback, because it seems likely to rain, and then you must stay all night." "That would be a good scheme," said Elizabeth, "if you were sure that they would not offer to send her home." Miss Bennet insists that Jane takes a horse so that when it rains, which it's likely to rain, she has to stay the night at Netherfield, and then she will have to meet Mr. Bingley in the morning or when he returns. Elizabeth says that would be a good idea as long as they don't offer to send her home in the carriage. But Miss Bennet knows for a fact, "Oh, but the gentlemen will have Mr. Bingley's chaise to go to Meryton, and the Hursts have no horses to theirs. I had much rather go in the coach. But, my dear, your father cannot spare the horses, I am sure. They are wanted in the farm. Mr. Bennet, are they not?" So Miss Bennet is making a statement for her father and asking for his agreement. "They are wanted in the farm much oftener than I can use them." He relents to his wife. "But if you have got them today," said Elizabeth, "my mother's purpose will be answered." She did at last extort from her father an acknowledgment that the horses were engaged. Jane was therefore obliged to go on horseback, and her mother attended her to the door with many cheerful prognostics of a bad day. Her hopes were answered. Jane had not been gone long before it rained hard. Her sisters were uneasy for her, but her mother was delighted. The rain continued the whole evening without intermission. Jane certainly could not come back. So Miss Bennet is overjoyed. Her plan worked. "This was a lucky idea of mine indeed," said Miss Bennet, more than once, as if the credit of making it rain were all her own. Till the next morning, however, she was not aware of all the felicity of her contrivance. Breakfast was scarcely over when a servant from Netherfield brought the following note for Elizabeth. "My dear Lizzie, I find myself very unwell this morning, which I suppose is to be imputed to my getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of my returning home till I am better. They insist also on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore, do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me. And excepting a sore throat and headache, there is not much the matter with me. Yours, etc." "Well, my dear," said Mr. Bennet, when Elizabeth had read the note aloud, "if your daughter should have a dangerous fit of illness, if she should die, it would be a comfort to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley and under your orders." This is what happens when the mother takes charge of the home and the dad is passive. Even though this was Miss Bennet's idea, Mr. Bennet is still responsible for his household. "Oh, I am not at all afraid of her dying. People do not die of trifling colds." Those are some wise words from Miss Bennet. So then Lizzie is determined to go visit Jane. "How can you be so silly," cried her mother, "as to think of such a thing in all this dirt? You will not be fit to be seen when you get there." "I shall be very fit to see Jane, which is all I want." Elizabeth is not going to meet the Bingleys and to visit around. She just wants to be with Jane. "Is this a hint to me, Lizzie," said her father, "to send for the horses?" Mr. Bennet doesn't know how to read the thoughts and wishes of the women in his house, and so here he's like, "Is this a hint? Does that mean you actually want the carriage?" "No, indeed. I do not wish to avoid the walk. The distance is nothing when one has a motive. Only 3 miles. I shall be back by dinner." Catherine and Lydia walk with Elizabeth most of the way. In Meryton they parted. The 2 youngest repaired to the lodgings of one of the officers' wives, and Elizabeth continued her walk alone, crossing field after field at a quick pace, jumping over stiles and springing over puddles with impatient activity, and finding herself at last within view of the house, with weary ankles, dirty stockings, and a face glowing with the warmth of exercise. This was not a very ladylike thing for her to do, but she isn't here to impress, she's just here for her sister. She was shown into the breakfast parlor where all but Jane were assembled, and where her appearance created a great deal of surprise. That she should have walked 3 miles so early in the day, in such dirty weather, and by herself, was almost incredible to Miss Hurst and Miss Bingley, and Elizabeth was convinced that they held her in contempt for it. She was received, however, very politely by them. And in their brother's manners, there was something better than politeness. There was good humor and kindness. Mr. Darcy said very little, and Mr. Hurst nothing at all. The former was divided between admiration of the brilliancy which exercise had given to her complexion, and doubt as to the occasion justifying her coming so far alone. The latter was thinking only of his breakfast. Mr. Darcy is divided between admiring the brilliancy which exercise had given to Elizabeth's complexion and whether or not coming to see her sister was merit enough for her to walk all that distance in the mud alone, specifically. That wasn't a very safe thing for a young lady to do. Her inquiries after her sister were not very favorably answered. Miss Bennet had slept ill, and though up, was very feverish and not well enough to leave her room. Elizabeth was glad to be taken to her immediately, and Jane, who had only been withheld by the fear of giving alarm or inconvenience from expressing in her note how much she longed for such a visit, was delighted at her entrance. She was not equal, however, to much conversation, and when Miss Bingley left them together, could attempt little beside expression of gratitude for the extraordinary kindness she was treated with. Elizabeth silently attended her. When breakfast was over, they were joined by the sisters, and Elizabeth began to like them herself when she saw how much affection and solicitude they showed for Jane. So she begins to like the sisters a little bit because they seem to care so much for Jane. But the next chapter over, she realizes, oh, they're not actually that worried about Jane. They forget her easily when they're playing cards and whatnot. The apothecary came and, having examined his patient, said, as might be supposed, that she had caught a violent cold and that they must endeavor to get the better of it. Advised her to return to bed and promised her some draughts. The advice was followed readily, for the feverish symptoms increased and her head ached acutely. Elizabeth did not quit her room for a moment, nor were the other ladies often absent. Elizabeth was planning on returning home, but Jane did not want to be left alone, and so Miss Bingley was obliged to invite her to stay instead of just sending her home in the chase. Please subscribe to my channel and join me for the rest of this book club. This is Bonnie Chandler with Tent Pegs and Milk, training you to be as harmless as doves and as wise as serpents, equipping you to serve milk and wield tent pegs.